Hey Chris, I really enjoyed your year-end book review, and I thought it was a really good idea. Instead of just typing out a bunch of reviews, which takes forever, hey, why not make a video about it? Didn't read nearly as many as you did, and not nearly as much as what I wanted to read this year. Was on the road a lot with my band. I did some touring, so um, didn't get as much of an opportunity to read the kind of books that I would want to read. Usually, when I'm on the road, I read books that I don't have to take notes on, and it takes a lot longer for me to read books that I really want to get something out of, just because I take a lot of notes and I really take a lot of time to digest it and all that. So um, here we go. The first book I read, actually, none of these are in order, so it's not the first book I read, but God of Promise by Michael Horton. And I think you said that you were reading this one um, coming up soon, but I really enjoyed this book. It just talked a lot about covenant theology, and what I was wanting to uh, find in this book was a contrast between covenant theology and dispensationalist theology, and didn't see. So I guess it wasn't really an apologetic work as much as it was just a explanation or an introduction to covenant theology. And of course, I don't agree with Michael Horton on paedobaptism, but really good book, very interesting. Not completely settled on the issue yet, but really enjoyed this one. Uh, the Lord of Glory by B.B. Warfield. This book was written a long time ago, and it's called a classic defense of the deity of Christ. And according to some, this is supposed to be the most thorough defense, or the best defense of the deity of Christ in print. And I don't know. I don't know what I'd compare it to say which one is the best, but I wasn't too incredibly impressed with B.B. Warfield, especially in light of modern criticisms against the deity of Christ. So, he had some good stuff to say. It was a pretty good book. Not too difficult to read, but he went through a lot of details in the Synoptic Gospels, which you don't see a whole lot of discussion of in I don't know, modern writings on Christology. So he did a lot of discussion on the synoptics, and talked about how the synoptics support the deity of Christ. So that was pretty valuable information. So I would recommend this book, just because it kind of goes against the grain and discusses things you don't normally see in Christological literature. So all right, that's that. And on the flip side of that issue, Patrick Novice's book, I guess that's how you pronounce his last name, a friend of mine, and he wrote this book called Divine Truth or Human Tradition. And basically it's his arguments against the Trinity. And I actually agreed with a lot of the things he said. In particular, the first few chapters where it talks about um, distinctions within theologians about what the Trinity is and what the basis is for all of that. So um, I can't say that I agreed with his exegetical conclusions, but he had a lot of interesting and valuable things to say as far as getting you to question your traditions and not holding to something just because it's a creed, but making sure that you have an explicit biblical foundation for what you believe. So I'd say that's what I got the most out of this, as opposed to Patrick's exegesis. Because I would say, even if you just disregarded the whole word Trinity completely, uh, it didn't start with that as a foundation, I still can't say I agreed with Patrick's exegesis on the key text. But a lot of good things to say, and it gets you to think, and I would say that's what I got the most out of this book. So very thick read, but I would recommend it to anyone if you just want to see a really good challenge to the traditional doctrine of the Trinity. Probably one of the best challenges in print from, I don't think Patrick would call himself an Arian, but that's probably the closest thing I can find to what Patrick actually believes, if I'm going to put a label on anything. So that's that. And Richard Bauckham's work, Jesus and the God of Israel. I guess if I was going to say what's the best defense of the deity of Christ, it'd probably be this one. I don't agree with everything Richard Bauckham says, of course. I don't agree with what any author says 100% of the time. He asserts a lot of things and doesn't necessarily back it all up with evidence, but what this book is going to get you to do if you read it is, especially if you're accustomed to thinking about the deity of Christ within Trinitarian or Greek categories, Richard Bauckham will get you to completely think about the issue in a different way. He has a totally different approach than what you would normally read from a Christology, because he has more of a, I guess he'd call it a divine identity Christology. So, very interesting book, and he goes into a lot of the details about the Qumran text and just other ancient Jewish literature. So there's a lot of discussion about non-biblical text and what the Second Temple Jewish thinkers would have thought about Jesus when he came on the scene, and how they would have viewed him in light of his claims and what others claimed about him. So, very interesting book, very highly recommended, even if you don't agree with it. He's got an approach that's worth thinking about. Alright, Ultimate Proof of Creation. It's by a guy named Jason Lisle, and this is a very unique book and probably the only one of its kind. What Jason Lisle is, he's an astronomer who works for Answers in Genesis, and what he's doing is he's taking a presuppositional approach to apologetics and applying it to the creation evolution controversy. And what you'll normally see from books about creation evolution is maybe someone's offering, what's the best proof of creation, and maybe someone will present, something like the information found in the DNA or whatever it might be. Well, Jason Lisle takes a different approach, and his main thesis is without creation, you can't prove anything at all. In other words, if God didn't create everything according to the Bible, and if the Bible isn't true, then you have no basis for even doing science or having rational thought. So that's Jason Lisle's primary theme in the book. And I would say that this is probably the best introductory book to the issue of presuppositional apologetics. A lot of people may recommend Bahnsen's book, Always Ready, which that's a very good book too, and it's also an introductory work. But I would say this is the best because it's very simple. A 10-year-old could read this and understand what's going on. So it provides a lot of good examples. Not extremely thorough, but I got a lot out of it, and I'm already familiar with the approach. So very highly recommend this book. Alright, the last thing I read was Greg Bahnsen's book, Presuppositional Apologetics, Stated and Defended. And this is a very interesting book because Greg Bahnsen wrote this book long before any of his other books. If I'm not mistaken, he was in his late 20s when he wrote this book, but he never actually published it himself. In fact, the transcript for this book was just recently found, like hiding behind a file cabinet in his office. And so whoever found the transcript decided to put this in print and edit it a little bit. But this is supposed to be Bahnsen's, I guess, the book that everyone hoped Bahnsen would have written, but he never actually wrote. Just a systematic defense of his it's not his presuppositional approach, but the traditional presuppositional approach to apologetics. And so that's what this book is supposed to be. And it's pretty thorough. It doesn't cover a very wide range of topics related to this issue. He has a lot of biblical discussion. Probably he exhausts the biblical defense of the presuppositional approach and also applies it to other so-called presuppositionalists like Gordon Clark and Francis Schaeffer and guys like that, and he kind of dissects their approach, which is claimed to be presuppositional, and I guess shares his perspective on those writings. And he also talks a lot about epistemology and issues related to that. So, very good book if you're interested in presuppositional apologetics. This is more advanced, but it's an absolute must-have. So that's all I've got, and I'm hoping next year we'll bring even more books. But Chris, I really enjoyed your video, and I thought it was a great idea to do that and just share what everyone else is reading. So thanks a lot.